December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
In the 1930s, Japan had already begun to reveal its imperial ambitions in Asia. After seizing Manchuria in 1931, it expanded the conflict into a full-scale invasion of China by 1937. By 1940, as Europe was engulfed in the chaos of World War II, Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, officially joining the Axis powers. Under the banner of building a new order in Asia, Tokyo's true intention was to expand its control southward into Indochina, a region that connected the Pacific and Indian Oceans. This move infuriated the United States and the Western powers. Washington, London, and The Hague responded with a series of embargoes on oil, steel, and other strategic materials, the lifeblood of Japan's economy and war machine. Cut off from nearly 80% of its oil imports, the very fuel that powered its navy, air force, and industry, Tokyo saw this as an ABCD encirclement: America, Britain, China, Dutch, a strangling blockade designed to bring Japan to its knees. Japan's leaders faced a stark choice: either withdraw their forces from China to lift the embargo, or seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia to supply themselves. After a series of secret meetings, they chose the latter: war. In the autumn of 1941, Imperial headquarters secretly drafted plans for an all-out war against the Western powers. At the heart of this was the Southern Expansion Plan, a strategy to occupy Southeast Asia and key Pacific islands to secure vital natural resources. According to the plan, Japan would invade Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and Burma, then build a massive defensive perimeter stretching from the Central to the South Pacific, encompassing the Bismarck Archipelago, Fiji, Samoa, and the Aleutians, to block any Allied counterattack. Tokyo believed that the United States and Britain, deeply entangled in the war against Germany and Italy in Europe, would not have the strength to respond effectively in the Far East. Aware that Japan could not match America's immense industrial power in a prolonged war, the High Command embraced a strategy of swift strike, quick peace, delivering a lightning blow that would shock Washington into negotiations and force recognition of Japan's dominance across Asia and the Pacific. To achieve this, they planned a decisive preemptive strike to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at its base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. If the attack succeeded, Japan believed America's will to fight would collapse, compelling it to seek peace before launching any major counteroffensive. Simultaneously, Japanese forces would strike British and Dutch colonies across Southeast Asia, conquering multiple targets at once. And so, on the night of December 7th and the dawn of December 8th, 1941, Tokyo time, the Empire of Japan unleashed its forces in all directions, igniting the largest war the Pacific had ever seen, a desperate gamble they believed they could only win by striking first. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The skies over Hawaii were clear, and the calm waters of Pearl Harbor shimmered under a pale golden sunrise. Inside the U.S. naval base, thousands of sailors were still resting. Some were preparing for the routine flag-raising ceremony. None of them knew that, within minutes, their peaceful morning would turn into an inferno. More than 300 nautical miles to the north, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, were cutting through the Pacific in silence. On their decks, 353 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes stood ready. The coded signal crackled through the radio. Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 confirming that total surprise had been achieved. At 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 aircraft took off, splitting into strike groups. At 7:48 a.m., they appeared over Oahu from the north. The roar of engines shattered the calm Sunday morning. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs rained down on the battleships moored side by side below. The massive vessels, USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, were engulfed in flames. A single bomb pierced the forward magazine of USS Arizona, triggering a cataclysmic explosion that split the ship in two and sent it to the bottom of the harbor, taking 1,177 men with it. Nearby, USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes and capsized completely. Trapped sailors banged on the steel hull from inside, their desperate signals fading into silence. At the same time, Japanese aircraft strafed and bombed the American airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island. Planes parked wing to wing on the runways were incinerated before they could take off. Fuel depots erupted in towering columns of black smoke. Within minutes, Pearl Harbor was ablaze. Around 8:40 a.m., a second wave of 170 Japanese aircraft swooped in, targeting what was left: destroyers, repair docks, airfields, and supply depots. A few surviving American pilots managed to take off, but fewer than 10 planes could fight back. Anti-aircraft guns blazed wildly, streaking the sky with tracers, but it was a futile defense. By 10 a.m., the last Japanese planes turned homeward. The sky over Oahu was shrouded in smoke. The sea was slick with oil, littered with debris, and bodies floated among the wreckage. 2,403 Americans were dead, more than 1,100 wounded, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, and 8 battleships sunk or crippled. Japan had achieved total surprise, but not total victory. The 3 U.S. aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, happened to be away at sea that day, spared from destruction. The vital oil depots, submarine bases, and repair facilities in Hawaii remained intact, assets that would later allow the U.S. Navy to recover with astonishing speed. For Japan, the strike seemed flawless, but for America, it was a moment of awakening. The images of the Arizona exploding, sailors leaping into burning water, and the stars and stripes blackened by smoke seared themselves into the nation's collective memory. The next morning, December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice was steady but charged with emotion. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Within minutes, Congress voted almost unanimously to declare war on Japan. Soon after, Britain, Canada, Australia, and other allied nations followed. On December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States. The world was now fully engulfed in flames. The smoke over Pearl Harbor had barely begun to clear when Japanese guns thundered across Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and Malaya. The Pacific War had begun, a 4-year storm of fire and steel that would change the course of human history. Only a few hours after the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan's war machine roared to life across the entire Asia-Pacific region. Because of the time difference, at dawn on December 8, 1941, Asia time, a wave of near-simultaneous attacks erupted, the beginning of a firestorm that would engulf half the world. Within just 2 days, Imperial Japan struck in every direction. Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines, Thailand, Wake Island, Guam, and the coast of China all became battlefields almost at once. Tokyo's strategy was simple but ruthless. Hit first, strike hard, and destroy the enemy's will to fight before they could even react. In Southeast Asia, the assault began at sunrise on December 8th. Elite Japanese divisions stormed ashore on the northern coast of Malaya, advancing rapidly under tropical rain. Tanks and artillery rolled inland, overwhelming the thin British defenses. At the same time, another Japanese column invaded Thailand. After only a few hours of skirmishing, the Thai government signed an armistice and agreed to join Japan's cause. From Thai territory, the Japanese advanced southward from two directions, putting the British stronghold of Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, under direct threat. That same morning, Hong Kong, Britain's century-old colony, came under siege. Japanese troops crossed from mainland China as aircraft and artillery pounded the city. Cut off and outgunned, the defenders held out for more than 2 weeks before finally surrendering on Christmas Day, December 25, 1941, ending more than 100 years of British rule. Across the Pacific, Japan pressed its lightning offensive against American territories. At noon on December 8th, Japanese bombers struck the Philippines, hitting Clark Field and Iba Field, destroying most of the U.S. aircraft still on the ground. Within hours, the archipelago's air defenses collapsed, opening the door to a massive invasion. On December 22, 1941, General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army landed at Lingayen Gulf on the northern coast of Luzon. Facing overwhelming force, General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces in the Philippines, ordered a strategic withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula west of Manila, following the pre-war Orange Plan. Manila was declared an open city, undefended, to spare it from destruction. By December 25th to 26th, all American and Filipino troops had retreated to Bataan, while Japanese forces occupied Manila without resistance. MacArthur relocated his headquarters to Corregidor Island in the middle of Manila Bay to continue the fight. Farther east, Wake Island, a tiny U.S. outpost in the Central Pacific, was attacked by Japanese aircraft on December 8th, local time. Though isolated, U.S. Marines on the island fought back ferociously, even repelling the first landing attempt, a rare American victory amid the early chaos. But 2 weeks later, the Japanese returned with overwhelming strength. On December 23rd, Wake fell. Nearly every defender was killed or captured. Meanwhile, between December 10th and 11th, Japanese forces landed on Guam, another American possession, and captured it within 2 days. Outnumbered and undersupplied, U.S. defenders fought until their ammunition ran out. Guam's fall gave Japan another vital base in its rapidly expanding Pacific defense ring. Amid the whirlwind of conquest, the Royal Navy suffered a devastating blow. On December 10, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers located the British fleet off the coast of Malaya. Within hours, 2 of Britain's most powerful warships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were sunk by torpedoes. Over 800 sailors perished. It was the first time in history that capital battleships had been destroyed entirely by aircraft, signaling the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. Together with the disaster at Pearl Harbor, this catastrophe shattered the prestige of the Western powers in the East. In less than 3 weeks, Imperial Japan had seized control of nearly all of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, a storm of steel and fire that no one seemed able to stop. As 1942 began, Japan's war machine only gained momentum. The tide of conquest surged forward, sweeping across Asia and the Pacific like wildfire. In just 2 months, the map of the Pacific changed beyond recognition. Territory after territory, once controlled by Britain, America, the Netherlands, and France, fell to the empire of the rising sun. In Southeast Asia, the campaign reached its brutal climax. After fierce fighting along the Malayan Peninsula, British, Indian, and Australian forces retreated to Singapore, the fortress the British had long believed to be impregnable. But that illusion shattered quickly. On the night of February 8, 1942, Japanese troops crossed the Johor Strait under cover of darkness and landed on the northern shore. Despite outnumbering the invaders and possessing strong fortifications, the defenders were exhausted, starved of supplies, morale, and hope. Within a week, on February 15, 1942, General Arthur Percival surrendered unconditionally. 130,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers became prisoners of war, one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Singapore, once the proud symbol of Western power in Asia, now lay beneath the flag of the rising sun. To the south, the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, collapsed in quick succession. By January, Japanese forces had swept through Borneo, seizing its vital oil fields. In February, they invaded Sumatra and Java, the core of the Dutch colony. In a desperate bid to resist, the Allied naval force ABDA, American, British, Dutch, Australian, gathered what ships remained to challenge Japan at sea. But the effort ended in disaster. In the Battle of the Java Sea at the end of February, nearly the entire Allied fleet was destroyed, including the British cruiser HMS Exeter and the American cruiser USS Houston. With their navy gone, Allied troops on Java were left stranded and surrendered in early March. In just 3 months, Japan had conquered nearly all of Southeast Asia, from Burma, Thailand, and Malaya to Indochina and Indonesia, forging a new empire that stretched across the entire region. Then Japan struck even farther. In April 1942, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, launched a bold raid into the Indian Ocean. His carrier fleet struck Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, with devastating force. Colombo and Trincomalee were bombed relentlessly. The British carrier HMS Hermes and several other warships were sunk. The British fleet withdrew all the way to East Africa, leaving Japan in control of the Western Pacific. By mid-1942, Japan's power had reached its zenith. To the west, its armies threatened India. To the south, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin, Australia's northern port city, multiple times, killing hundreds. And to the east, the empire's reach stretched deep into the Central Pacific. The rising sun now flew over an immense domain, from Manchuria and northern China, across East Asia, Indochina, and the entire Southeast Asian archipelago to the islands of New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Gilberts. In the first half year of the war, Japan had crushed nearly all Allied resistance in Asia. Hundreds of thousands were dead or captured. In many occupied lands, locals, weary of Western colonialism, mistook the Japanese as liberators. But beneath the surface, the empire's strength was already cracking. The lightning campaign had lasted longer than Tokyo planned. Logistics were stretched thin. Japan had seized resource-rich territories like Borneo and Sumatra, but could not fully exploit them. The empire had expanded too far, too fast. And this time its enemy was no longer a scattered colonial garrison. It was the United States, now fully awake and determined to strike back. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, resistance still burned. For 3 long months in early 1942, 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers held out in the jungles of Bataan, starving, sick, yet unbroken. They became symbols of American defiance. But no reinforcements came. Supplies ran out. On April 9, 1942, General Edward King surrendered to save the remaining lives. What followed was one of the most infamous atrocities of the war, the Bataan Death March. 76,000 prisoners of war were forced to march more than 100 kilometers under the scorching sun, without food or water. Over 5,000 men died from exhaustion, starvation, or execution along the way. The world recoiled at the brutality, and Japan's image as a liberator dissolved into horror. Before Bataan fell, General Douglas MacArthur had been ordered to evacuate. On the night of March 11, 1942, he slipped out of Corregidor Island by boat, escaping to Australia under direct orders from President Roosevelt. Once there, he made a vow that would echo through history: "I shall return." His promise became the rallying cry of America's coming counteroffensive. For a few more weeks, a small garrison held out on Corregidor, the last bastion in Manila Bay. But on May 6, 1942, General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered, ending all organized resistance in the Philippines. After 5 months of bitter fighting, the islands were fully under Japanese control. By early May, the rising sun flag flew over nearly every major stronghold across Asia and the Pacific. Japan seemed unstoppable. Yet even at this height of triumph, the gears of its war machine began to grind. The first cracks had appeared. The tide of history was about to turn. Amid what seemed like Japan's unstoppable advance, the Allies began to strike back, small blows that carried enormous symbolic weight. In April 1942, less than 5 months after the devastation of Pearl Harbor, the United States carried out a daring plan meant to prove that Japan was not untouchable. On April 18th, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet secretly approached the Japanese coast. From its deck, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle thundered into the sky, flying over Tokyo and several other cities on Honshu to drop bombs on Japan's home islands for the first time in history. The Doolittle raid caused little physical damage, yet its psychological impact was immense. For Japan, it was a deep shock, proof that even the sacred homeland could be reached. For the United States, it restored confidence after months of grim news. The raid also revealed a crucial reality. The surviving American carriers remained a serious threat. Alarmed, Japan's high command concluded that passive defense was no longer enough. They had to strike first again, expanding their defensive perimeter to push the U.S. fleet far from Japan's shores. Emboldened by months of victory, Japan's military leaders began drafting Phase 2 of their war plan, a sweeping expansion across the Pacific. Their ambitions were vast: seize New Guinea and the Bismarck Islands to block the route to Australia, capture Fiji, Samoa, and the Aleutians, and even cut Australia off entirely from American support. But resources were running thin. The army was bogged down in China and refused to spare troops for an Australian invasion. In the end, Tokyo approved a narrower but still audacious strategy: capture Port Moresby in southern New Guinea to threaten Australia directly, and at the same time force a decisive naval showdown with the United States. To set the trap, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, chose Midway Atoll, a tiny coral island halfway between Asia and Hawaii, as the bait. He believed the Americans would fight to the last to protect it, since from Midway their aircraft could threaten Hawaii itself. When the U.S. fleet arrived, Yamamoto planned to ambush and annihilate it, ending American sea power once and for all. To realize this vision, Japan prepared 2 massive offensives in May and June 1942. One thrusting south toward New Guinea, the other striking east toward Midway. Yet these very operations, conceived to secure Japan's dominance, would instead set the stage for the greatest turning point of the Pacific War. In early May 1942, Japan launched Operation MO, a bold plan to seize Port Moresby, the Allied stronghold on the southern coast of New Guinea. If successful, Japan would dominate the sea routes north of Australia and completely isolate the continent from its Western allies. The plan was meticulously prepared. Japan's first move was to occupy Tulagi Island in the Solomon Islands on May 3, 1942, establishing an advance reconnaissance and refueling base. Next, the main strike force, consisting of 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, 1 light carrier, Shoho, and dozens of escorting warships, would sweep through the Coral Sea, destroy any Allied fleet in the area, and cover the invasion convoy scheduled to land at Port Moresby around May 10th. But the plan was no longer a secret. American naval intelligence, having successfully broken Japan's communication codes, intercepted the operational orders. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, armed with this information, set up an ambush. He dispatched a task force under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, centered on the carriers USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, along with their escorts, to lie in wait in the Coral Sea. On May 7, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea erupted, the first naval engagement in history fought entirely by aircraft. The 2 opposing fleets never saw each other directly. Their fates were decided by pilots and planes hundreds of miles apart. That morning, reconnaissance squadrons from both sides scoured the vast expanse of ocean in search of targets. Due to faulty intelligence, Japanese aircraft mistakenly attacked and sank an American oiler and a destroyer, believing them to be carriers. Meanwhile, planes from Yorktown and Lexington located the light carrier Shoho. In a devastating strike, waves of bombers and torpedo planes descended, sinking her within minutes. A jubilant U.S. pilot radioed the now famous message, "Scratch 1 flat top." The next day, May 8th, both sides unleashed their full carrier air groups. The sky over the Coral Sea turned into a storm of fire and smoke. Japanese Zeros and American Wildcats dueled among the clouds as bombs and torpedoes rained down on the great ships below. When the battle finally ended, the U.S. carrier Lexington had been destroyed after multiple hits and internal explosions, while Yorktown suffered severe damage and was forced to withdraw. The Japanese carrier Shokaku was heavily crippled, its flight deck shattered, and Zuikaku lost most of its aircraft and veteran pilots. With their striking power gone, the Japanese fleet canceled the Port Moresby invasion, the first time in the war that a Japanese offensive had been stopped. Although both sides suffered comparable losses, the battle was a strategic victory for the Allies. Japan failed to capture Port Moresby, their main objective. The U.S., despite losing Lexington, managed to repair Yorktown in only 3 days, a feat of incredible speed and determination. More importantly, Japan's Shokaku and Zuikaku were knocked out of action for months, stripping the Imperial Navy of nearly half its carrier air strength. Unaware of it, Japan was entering the next phase of the war with only 4 operational fleet carriers, roughly equal to the U.S. After the setback at sea, Japan shifted its focus to capturing Port Moresby by land. In July 1942, Japanese troops landed on the northern coast of New Guinea and began advancing along the treacherous Kokoda Track, a narrow jungle trail winding through steep mountains toward the south. Facing them were small, under-equipped Australian reserve units, who fought tenaciously despite overwhelming odds to buy time for reinforcements. The Japanese advance slowed under grueling conditions: rain-soaked jungles, disease, starvation, and exhaustion. By September 1942, when they were only a few dozen kilometers from Port Moresby, fresh Australian troops launched a fierce counterattack, driving the Japanese back across the mountains. Around the same time, in August 1942, Japanese forces assaulted the Allied base at Milne Bay, on the eastern tip of New Guinea. This time, the defenders, a combined force of Australian and American troops, repelled the attack completely. The Battle of Milne Bay marked a historic milestone, the first time Japanese ground forces were decisively defeated in World War II. From the Coral Sea to Kokoda and Milne Bay, Japan's string of defeats signaled one undeniable truth: the era of their unchecked expansion had come to an end. In early June 1942, after the failure of the Coral Sea Campaign, Japan's Imperial General Staff set its sights on a decisive blow, the capture of Midway Atoll, a small ring of coral islands in the heart of the Pacific, regarded as the gateway to Hawaii. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, believed that by destroying the remaining American aircraft carriers, Japan could seize total control of the Pacific theater. He poured nearly all of Japan's naval strength into this gamble, a massive operation on a scale never seen before. Taking part in the battle were Japan's four most powerful carriers at the time, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with 7 battleships, over 150 other warships, 248 aircraft, and tens of thousands of sailors. Yamamoto's plan was complex. One force would strike the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, attacking Attu and Kiska to draw the Americans north, while the main carrier strike group under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would attack Midway itself, luring the U.S. fleet out of Pearl Harbor and destroying it in an ambush. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that his entire plan had already been decoded by U.S. intelligence. American cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor had cracked much of Japan's JN-25 naval code, identifying that the code name AF referred to Midway. With this information, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, saw an opportunity to turn the tide. He made a bold, high-risk decision to position all 3 remaining U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. If he was wrong, Hawaii itself would be defenseless. At dawn on June 4, 1942, as the first light broke over the Pacific, Admiral Nagumo launched the opening strike. From 200 miles away, 108 Japanese bombers and Zero fighters roared into the sky and descended on Midway in waves of fire. Explosions ripped through fuel tanks and airstrips, but the island's defenses held firm. American planes scrambled to meet the attack. Most were shot down, yet their resistance forced Nagumo to reconsider a second strike. While he debated, new reconnaissance reports arrived. An enemy task force had been sighted to the east. But the information was vague, and Nagumo hesitated. Believing he might face U.S. ships, he ordered his returning aircraft to be rearmed, swapping their land bombs for torpedoes. On the decks of the 4 carriers, hundreds of crewmen rushed to refuel planes, roll out munitions, and reload weapons, creating a chaotic scene of open fuel lines and armed bombs strewn across hangars. It was the most vulnerable moment the Japanese fleet would ever face. At 10:20 a.m., as the Japanese were still arming their aircraft, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the U.S. carriers Enterprise and Yorktown appeared suddenly through the clouds. After hours of searching, the American pilots had stumbled upon the enemy almost by accident. But it was perfect timing. From an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters, they dove almost vertically, engines screaming, releasing 500-kilogram bombs with deadly precision. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in flames. The bombs tore through their hangars, igniting fuel and ordnance, triggering massive explosions that turned the ships into fireballs visible for miles. Black smoke towered skyward as sailors and pilots were incinerated where they stood. Far away, aboard the flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto was struck silent as reports flooded in. 3 of Japan's 4 elite carriers, the pride of its navy, were gone in less than 10 minutes. It was a disaster beyond imagining. The last surviving carrier, Hiryu, struck back with desperate determination. Her air groups launched 2 counterattacks, striking USS Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes that left her crippled and sinking by the afternoon. But by evening, American planes from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu through the drifting smoke and struck in return, setting her ablaze. Within hours, the 4th Japanese carrier followed her sisters to the bottom. When night fell over Midway, the ocean still burned. In just 2 days, June 4th to 5th, 1942, Japan had lost all 4 of its main carriers, 1 cruiser, over 300 aircraft, and more than 3,000 of its most skilled sailors and pilots, men who could never be replaced. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, lost only USS Yorktown and about 150 aviators. Realizing the battle was lost, Yamamoto ordered a full withdrawal. The once invincible fleet turned back toward Japan, leaving behind a sea littered with burning wreckage, the gravestones of Japan's naval supremacy. The Battle of Midway entered history as the strategic turning point of World War II in the Pacific, the moment when Japan's dominance was shattered and the balance of power finally began to shift. The victory at Midway gave the United States strategic initiative across the Pacific. From that point forward, Japan, though still vast in territory and formidable in manpower, was forced into a defensive war, while the Allies began preparing their long and brutal counteroffensive to reclaim the Pacific, one battle at a time. After the victory at Midway, as naval dominance began to tilt toward the Allies, the United States launched a limited counteroffensive, one not overly risky yet decisive enough to strip Japan of its strategic initiative. The first target was Guadalcanal, a small island in the Solomon Islands chain, east of New Guinea. There, Japanese forces were hastily building an unfinished airfield, later to be known as Henderson Field, intended to control the vital sea lanes between America and Australia. If completed, the entire South Pacific would fall within range of Japanese aircraft. The U.S. command knew they had to strike before it was too late. At dawn on August 7, 1942, under the protection of Allied warships, more than 14,000 U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi. The small Japanese garrison, caught completely off guard, was swiftly overrun. By the next day, the Americans had captured the half-built airfield, immediately repairing it and naming it Henderson Field, in honor of Loftus Henderson, a pilot killed at Midway. The landing marked the first major ground offensive by Allied forces against Japan and signaled the beginning of a long counteroffensive in the Pacific. Yet the American foothold on the island was perilously fragile. On the night of August 8th to 9th, 1942, while U.S. transports were still unloading supplies offshore, a Japanese cruiser force under Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa approached undetected from the north. In the ensuing chaos of the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese ships unleashed a devastating surprise attack, sinking 4 Allied cruisers, 3 American, 1 Australian, in less than an hour and killing over 1,000 sailors. The sea was ablaze with burning oil and exploding shells, a fiery testament to one of the worst naval defeats in U.S. history. But instead of pressing his advantage and attacking the vulnerable transport ships, Mikawa, fearing daylight airstrikes, ordered a retreat. That decision inadvertently saved the American campaign. Though deprived of heavy naval cover, the Marines onshore still had enough supplies to dig in and prepare for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. In Tokyo, Japan's high command initially dismissed the Guadalcanal landings as a minor raid. Only by late August, when reconnaissance confirmed that Henderson Field was operational under U.S. control, did the Imperial General Staff grasp the true scale of the threat. Reinforcements were rushed south, and thus began one of the longest and bloodiest struggles of the entire Pacific War. On land, waves of Japanese troops were sent across treacherous seas in risky night runs, determined to retake the airfield. With cries of "Banzai," they hurled themselves against Marine defenses, believing that sheer will and spirit could overcome American firepower. But the Marines, supported by naval guns and aircraft from Henderson Field, repelled every assault. On the night of August 21st at the Tanaru River, hundreds of Japanese soldiers were mowed down in hours. In mid-September at Bloody Ridge, Colonel Merritt Edson's men held firm against a full-scale Japanese attack, killing over 1,000 enemy troops. The island's jungles became a living hell, thick with humidity, disease, and the stench of death. Malaria, hunger, and exhaustion claimed nearly as many lives as bullets. At sea, the fighting was no less savage. By day, American aircraft dominated the skies. By night, the Japanese ruled the waves, sending in convoys mockingly nicknamed the Tokyo Express to bring reinforcements under cover of darkness. Each run often ended in fierce combat. On October 11th, during the Battle of Cape Esperance, U.S. cruisers ambushed and sank 2 Japanese warships. 2 weeks later, on October 26th, carrier fleets clashed again in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The USS Hornet was sunk and the Enterprise heavily damaged, but Japan paid a devastating price, losing 2 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The climax came in mid-November 1942, when Japan threw everything it had left, including 2 battleships, into one last desperate effort to destroy Henderson Field. For 3 nights, November 12th to 15th, the waters off Guadalcanal blazed with explosions as both sides fought in one of the most brutal naval battles of World War II. 2 Japanese battleships were sunk. Many vessels on both sides were lost, including the USS Juno, which went down with the 5 Sullivan brothers aboard. By the battle's end, the Japanese fleet was forced to withdraw, leaving thousands of starving troops stranded on the island, cut off from all resupply. The survivors faced a nightmare of hunger and disease. They lived on roots, muddy water, and in some cases, the flesh of fallen comrades. The Japanese nicknamed Guadalcanal Shikikanshima, the island of hunger. By late December 1942, with American forces tightening their grip around Henderson Field, Japan's high command finally conceded defeat. On December 31st, Emperor Hirohito approved a full evacuation, yet the withdrawal could not be carried out at once. The fighting continued into the new year. Throughout January 1943, scattered Japanese units clung desperately to the jungles, while warships exchanged fire offshore. Only in early February 1943, under the cover of darkness, did Japan manage to evacuate the remnants of its army in a secret operation codenamed Operation K. When the last ships departed, more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers had already perished on the island. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942 and ended in February 1943, became one of the most decisive and costly battles of the Pacific War. It was the second great turning point after Midway, marking the moment when Japan irreversibly lost the initiative and entered a long, grueling defensive struggle that would end only with its collapse 2 years later. Looking back at the Pacific War during 1941 to 1942, it was one of the most turbulent and transformative chapters in modern history, a time when the Japanese Empire rose to its greatest heights, only to begin its rapid descent within a single year. The conflict began with a string of stunning Japanese victories. In quick succession, Japan occupied Manchuria, invaded China, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, swept triumphantly across Southeast Asia, conquering Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, and pushing deep into New Guinea. From Tokyo to the farthest reaches of the Pacific, Japanese citizens believed that the dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had become a reality. The Imperial Navy was at the height of its power, and Japan's soldiers advanced with the conviction that sheer will and discipline could overcome any foe. But history soon turned against them. From the summer of 1942, a series of devastating defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal shattered the myth of Japan's invincibility. In just 2 days at Midway, Japan lost 4 of its frontline aircraft carriers, the backbone of its naval might. Then, at Guadalcanal, a small island became a grinding battlefield where tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers perished in the jungles, at sea, and under the relentless rain of American bombs. These defeats marked not just military losses, but a psychological and strategic collapse of Japan's expansionist ambitions. By late 1942, the strategic initiative had completely shifted to the Allies. Japan's economy, already strained by years of war, began to collapse under its own weight. Deprived of vital resources like oil and steel, its factories could no longer replace the ships, planes, and tanks being lost in battle. In contrast, the United States' vast industrial power, the so-called arsenal of democracy, was now in full motion. American shipyards launched new vessels every month, aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the thousands, and fresh divisions were mobilized and trained faster than Japan could react. At the same time, the global tide of war was turning. Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were being checked in North Africa and the Soviet Union, allowing the Western Allies to shift resources toward the Pacific. By late 1942, a broad Allied counteroffensive was underway. In New Guinea, Australian and American forces halted Japan's advance along the Kokoda Track. In the Solomon Islands, they clung to and eventually secured Guadalcanal, while in Burma and China, British, Indian, and Chinese forces reopened vital supply routes. Across the Pacific, American aircraft began to dominate the skies, while submarines and surface fleets steadily strangled Japan's maritime supply lines, the lifeline of its empire. As the year ended, the picture of the war had completely reversed. Japan, once the aggressor, was now on the defensive, desperately fortifying a chain of island strongholds stretching from the Marianas and Carolines to the Philippines, hoping to hold out long enough for a miracle. The Allies, meanwhile, prepared for a bold new phase, the island hopping strategy, aimed at bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions and seizing one key island after another, moving steadily closer to Japan itself. The first 2 years of the Pacific War had revealed lessons that would echo through history. Japan had triumphed early through surprise, audacity, and fierce morale, but it ultimately fell victim to strategic overreach, logistical weakness, and a dangerous faith in spirit over substance. The United States, by contrast, prevailed through adaptation, organization, and an unmatched industrial and human capacity for endurance. The years 1941 to 1942 closed with the fires of Midway and Guadalcanal still blazing in memory, twin beacons that reshaped the entire course of the war. From that moment onward, the Pacific conflict entered its next, even bloodier phase, a relentless Allied offensive that would reclaim the ocean, island by island, through fire and sacrifice. The road to Tokyo would be long and costly, but by the end of 1942, the world already knew which side would prevail.